Well, thanks for coming along and thanks for waiting. I'm going to have to ask you to wait just for a little bit longer. There's a few things I want to walk through when it comes to payroll tax. I'm sorry I was a little bit late. I've just been at my GP getting some vaccines for a trip that I'm taking to Papua New Guinea for Queensland to promote trade and investment. We're Australia's Pacific state and we'll be meeting with business interests and government leaders in PNG to promote Queensland and investment and trade. The first thing I want to talk about this afternoon is how revenue measures in Queensland are enforced. The government enacts the legislation, but then the enforcement of that legislation is done by the Queensland Revenue Office, led at the moment by the Acting Commissioner of State Revenue. That's how it should be. We shouldn't have politicians deciding how people comply with the tax laws of this state. Like income tax, payroll tax is self-assessed. That means a business determines whether it's liable for payroll tax, possibly taking advice from accountants and lawyers. And like income tax, compliance is undertaken by the Revenue Office, in this case, the Queensland Revenue Office. I'm advised by the Acting Commissioner of State Revenue that the Queensland Revenue Office routinely undertakes compliance activities relating to contractor payments. Contractors, from a payroll tax point of view, come from industries like building and construction, and cleaning and security. A small number of these contractors are GPs. Compliance activities are central to ensuring that payroll tax is being administered correctly and in a consistent manner for all taxpayers. People might not like paying tax, but I'm sure everyone would agree it's appropriate that people pay their fair share. I'm advised the Queensland Revenue Office is not specifically targeting general practitioners and medical practices in its compliance activities. That's unlike New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia and South Australia, where the GP's own newsletter points out revenue officers are specifically targeting medical practices. Depending on their specific circumstances, it's possible that medical practices may be detected as part of the Queensland Revenue Office's standard compliance approach. Medical practices that use contractor arrangements may be the subject of payroll tax compliance in the same way as other industries that use contractors. On the 18th of October this year, the Acting Commissioner of State Revenue met with representatives of the Australian Medical Association and the Royal College of General Practitioners. They discussed the impact of payroll tax on medical practices. At that meeting, the Acting Commissioner of State Revenue confirmed there is no compliance activity underway that specifically targets medical practices. The Acting Commissioner of State Revenue agreed to provide a letter summarising how the relevant payroll tax contractor provisions may apply to medical practices. That was sent to the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners on the 28th of October. That's important. My advice from the Acting Revenue Commissioner is that the approach in relation to the administration of contractor provisions for general practitioners and medical practices is long-standing and has not changed recently. The treatment of contractor payments for payroll tax is long-standing. In their current form, the contractor provisions of the Payroll Tax Act have been in place since 2008, some 14 years. So some things have changed though, and that as a consequence of so many things is because of COVID. During the pandemic, you may recall the government put in place a number of measures to temporarily ease the burden on business. That was appropriate. There were payroll tax refunds, deferrals and holidays, and most compliance action was suspended. As our economies recovered and recovered strongly and conditions have improved, those temporary measures came to an end, so compliance has naturally resumed. As compliance resumed, the Revenue Office has had access to better data matching, particularly through the Australian Taxation Office. That's led to the identification of compliance issues in a number of contractors. Prior to COVID-19, the Queensland Revenue Office was identifying on average about 70 issues a year with payroll tax for contractors. Last year, that rose to 195. Of those, 18 were medical practices. So far, since July this year, they've identified issues with 71 contractors. So far, 4 of the 71 are medical practices. So again, that's because they're contractors, not because they're GPs, and not because GPs are being specifically targeted. As in the case with income tax, compliance issues may be identified in previous years. That's the same for any taxpayer. When they're identified, businesses that owe payroll tax can ask the Revenue Office for a repayment plan if they need to catch up on their payment obligations. Thanks for your patience. Happy to take any questions on that.
Treasurer, obviously, listening to all those points there about how the payroll tax is coordinated, what do you say to doctors who say this will end bulk billing in Queensland?
Well, bulk billing is not connected to payroll tax. As a former health minister, I know quite clearly the problems with general practice and primary care in this country due to a decade of neglect by the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison LNP governments. So there is no direct relationship between payroll tax and bulk billing. This is a Medicare issue, and that's the responsibility of the federal government.
What they are saying, though, is it will affect the profitability of the business to the point where they won't be able to offer bulk billing services to patients anymore.
Well, as I've made clear, this is not to do specifically, we're not targeting general practice or medical centres. What we're doing is ensuring compliance with the law of Queensland, and that's for contractors generally. And so far, there's been 71 compliance audits this year. Only 4 relate to medical practices. So that's a pretty small percentage, I think about 5% of the entire compliance activities for contractors, and that's probably appropriate given the numbers.
What if those contractors owns, like, say, 3 medical practices? So despite that just being 4 contractors identified, it could actually have a bigger flow-on effect in terms of actual clinics that those contractors own.
Well, again, 71 compliance audits this year, 4 relate to medical practices. It's not to do with GPs or medical practices specifically. It's due to the compliance activity for contractors, and we're doing that across businesses and industries in Queensland.
Treasurer, what would you say to the AMHU's call for a more permanent exemption for GPs given the pressures that they're under?
Well, as I've said, and I've said it a number of times now, there's been no change to the regime for payroll tax relating to contractors since 2008. This has been a standard practice and standard procedure for the State Revenue Office now for 14 years. So there's been no changes. There was a change for a couple of years due to COVID. We gave businesses a break. We helped them get through COVID through payroll tax refunds, deferrals and holidays. But as our economy's strengthened again, we need to get back to where we were, which is regular compliance activities, nothing more or nothing less than we did prior to COVID, to make sure everyone pays their fair share of tax. And that's all the Revenue Office
Dr.
does.
Aaron Chambers says this is definitely a change in the way that the law is being interpreted in their view. They say practices will go broke as a result. But are you saying that they should have always been paying this tax?
Well, that's not my advice from the Queensland Revenue Office. They're doing what they've always done, ensuring compliance with the law, but they're not specifically targeting medical practices or GPs. They're doing what they have to do to just ensure compliance with revenue law in Queensland.
So is the AMHU fear-mongering to try and get an exemption from this tax?
All I can do is tell you what the Queensland Revenue Office is doing on advice. Of course, we don't have politicians making decisions about who pays tax and who doesn't. That's appropriate. I don't interfere with the administration of taxation law in Queensland, nor should I as the Treasurer. I leave that to the Commissioner of State Revenue, and I trust them that they will exercise their judgment and act in an appropriate way to ensure that balance between ensuring people pay tax as is fair and appropriate so we can deliver the services that a growing state needs. And we are the growth state of the Commonwealth. We know that more people are coming here than ever before. So we need to ensure we have a strong and fair revenue base for the people of Queensland.
Just on that, I mean, we've got 2 completely contrasting narratives here. You're saying repeatedly that nothing has changed, and then we're hearing these medical voices saying that the payroll tax interpretation has been radically changed. Are they telling fibs?
Look, all I can give you is the facts. Last year, number of compliance issues rose to 195 from 70. So we know there were more compliance issues, but again, there are only 18 medical practices and medical centres involved last year. That was about 9% of compliance issues, compliance activities, and this year there's been 71 contractors identified for compliance, and only 4 of those have been medical practices. So unlike other states, which you've heard from the GP's own journal, where there are a number of states that are targeting general practice, but that's not happening in Queensland, and that's the way the Revenue Commission has determined it should be.
Do you trust the AMAQ?
Yes,
Treasurer,
I worked very cooperatively and closely with them when I was the Health Minister. Anything else?
a couple of questions. The CFMEU and unions were protesting at the site today. They targeted you personally, saying public sector pay is falling behind. What's your response to them targeting you personally about that claim?
Well, our government has the most generous public sector wage deal in the country. And in a sense, we're leading the private sector. So Queensland is setting the standard for public sector workers. We're setting the standard for the general workforce, and that's appropriate in an environment where the cost of living is increasing. We're looking after our workers. We've got, as I say, the most generous wage outcome in the country. But of course, we leave it to various departments to negotiate the final enterprise bargaining agreement, and that's how it should be. So agencies will work through the particular details for the particular workforce once we set the wage framework, and that's what we've done as a government. I'll leave it to other departments to work through those issues, workforce by workforce.
Are the union claims relatively baseless then that they're making about you, given what you just said?
No, all I'm saying is we have the most generous wages policy in the country, and we always work in good faith with our workforce. We always work in good faith with our unions. We've always done that as a Labor government, and we'll always do that. So we'll work through those issues, as I say, workforce by workforce, department by department, agency by agency, to land those enterprise agreements. But we're going to look after our workers in a tough time when it comes to cost of living.
There's some explanatory notes just tabled in Parliament just then about the land tax, about how the government's decision to not proceed at this time with changes to Queensland's land tax framework. The critical phrase there being "at this time." Are you planning to reintroduce it at another time?
No.
Pulling it out?
That's right.
Thank you
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for your time. Sorry to keep you waiting again. Thank you.
Thank you.